This is Reality Jukebox. Hello, welcome back to Reality Jukebox.
Welcome.
Hi, George.
Hello, Ross.
How's it going?
Yeah, very good. I'm very excited to be talking about a great topic today. Yeah, great to see you again, and hopefully we can have another good conversation.
Well, today we're going to talk about, we're going to be doing it a lot actually over the next few series, and that's subcultures. Those of you that have heard the word but don't know what it is, it's basically musical and fashion movements that have happened over the years that basically in the end get railroaded and become extremely commercialised or whatever, but they normally start out as an underground thing basically. So I'll just give you a few examples of subcultures, mods, rude boys, hippies, goth. There's so many. There are so many. But the first one we're going to talk about, which is something that I was involved with when I was at school, which is the new wave of British heavy metal. New wave of British heavy metal,
which you've all seen abbreviated. But so I'd love to hear about first-hand experiences, because we've all heard about the influence. But tell me a little bit about it being on the ground.
Well, firstly, it's been written down that I was involved with it, and at the time, when I look back on it now, I was. But I had a very different background to a lot of the other people that were involved with it, and maybe still are now, still talk about it now. But it's something definitely worth, subject definitely worth visiting.
Absolutely.
And discussing. We're going to do two parts of this. We'll explain at the end about what the second part will be about. We'd love your feedback, not only about this, but of course with subcultures.
Yeah.
And if you belong to any subcultures or any that you didn't like or whatever.
You did, yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, with the new wave of British heavy metal, it was really interesting how that evolved. I mean, I was at school, and at school it was sort of punk and new wave. Mm-hmm. And my background really before that was I'd started playing instruments from a very young age. My father, who wasn't into music, he was creative, he made fashion and all that stuff, and this is where this comes into it. Sort of introduced me as a very young child into sort of old R&B, jazz, and other family relatives, Elvis, which we've spoken about, which is my nan, and there was soul music as well. And at school, I discovered rock music.
Awesome.
Much to my father's, he didn't understand it, whatever.
You've all been there.
So it was an interesting time sort of hearing that. And then the punk thing happened.
Yeah.
And really my first real... I saw the Stranglers supporting somebody called Patti Smith. I was literally a child seeing that gig, and it was trying to understand that whole show or whatever. It was absolutely brilliant.
Where was it?
Hammersmith, what is Hammersmith Apollo now?
It was a great venue.
Hammersmith Odeon, yeah. The Stranglers were supported. Sort of going to see that, it sort of opened my eyes. And at that time, people were really into... which I got into as well, was I like David Bowie, in particular, and there was a couple of artists, and Roxy Music especially, I was into that, which is not even remotely connected with the new wave of British heavy metal, but it influenced the band that I put together. So what basically happened was punk came along, reggae was with it, but reggae never got into the heavy metal thing or whatever. But the punk thing happened, and I remember hearing Pretty Vacant by the Sex Pistols, London Calling by the Clash, and then I heard Teenage Kicks by the Undertones.
Classic.
Which even now, when I hear it, I get shivers down my spine.
It's massive, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the track cost about £16 to record or something.
£16 to record. Yeah. Wow.
And it's, even now when I hear it, it's just total and utter anti everything.
That's amazing. £16 in current times, that'll get you 3 pints if you're lucky.
If you're lucky. Agreed. If you're lucky. And I remember buying the single. I remember buying it and just playing it and playing it and playing it. And then I was also used to go and see a band called Thin Lizzy, who weren't really sort of like a heavy metal band, and they weren't really a they weren't a new wave band, they were far from it. They sat in between that. So a lot of rock and heavy metal, not so much heavy metal, but a lot of rock bands became very unfashionable during the punk era. We will talk about punk, we'll go into it more in another episode. And then new wave came along. And you'd get a lot of American acts, Patti Smith, who we mentioned before, Talking Heads. There was quite a few acts, and in certain parts of the country, there was a lot of kids like myself that probably listened to bands like Black Sabbath, which came along years later with Nirvana. They obviously listened to Black Sabbath or whatever. I wasn't a great fan, but it rubbed off on me without a shadow of a doubt. It rubbed off on me, and you found that during that new wave period, a lot of metal bands started to actually, or a few metal bands, new metal bands started to evolve, like Motorhead, who'd been around actually when punk was around. They played the Roundhouse and places like that.
And before, the guys in Motorhead were all in bands prior to that.
Oh, Lemmy was in Hawkwind.
Well, this is where the contentious, which we'll mention later on, is there's a real divide here. Are Motorhead new wave or British heavy metal? Or are they heavy? Are they metal? Or are they something else? Because they were kicking around before that sort of scene, but also they're very much embraced as one of the figureheads of the scene as well.
Absolutely, there's no. I think the particular genre of music has a lot to thank Ian Kidderminster. Lemmy.
Legend.
For what he did.
It
was absolutely incredible. You know what he did. And basically what happened was the new wave of British heavy metal sort of came along round about the new wave time as well. These bands started appearing, and one of the music papers, Sounds, and I remember school reading, it was a journalist called Jeff Barton, who picked up on it. And it started to gain a lot of publicity. And all of a sudden these bands sort of came up from nowhere, and of course then it was extremely easy put a band together, get out on the road and go and gig at what we call toilet venues. They were all over the place, not only in London, where we're from, but and I remember the venues really well. There's places like the Leeds 4 Green, the Porterhouse, I think it was it was Chesterfield. There was loads of them. They were everywhere. And it developed into a subculture. And the kids wore black leather motorbike jackets. And now they're it's different. It's mainstream fashion now.
Well, a lot of the whole leather and studs. It was a priest, a Judas Priest, wasn't it? Was kind of the guys that kind of really kind of put that sort of style on the map.
Well, they came along in the 70s. They came along way before that, but they adapted themselves during that period. And a lot of the acts, there was a few metal acts that are rock acts at that time, managed to go from having like the long, this long hair and wearing sort of what you would say like a caftan top or whatever, to where that particular part of what you would probably call fashion, whatever. The studs and the piercings definitely, and tattoos definitely came from the punk thing. There's no doubt about that. But it was interesting how it worked, and some of these bands became really, really huge, and still are to this day. The other band like Thin Lizzy was AC/DC, who were regularly touring the UK.
From Australia.
Scotland. The two brothers, was one left, unfortunately the other one passed away. They originally came from Scotland or whatever, but it was an Australian invention. Any Australian listeners here, we have to thank Australia for giving us one of the greatest bands that have ever existed. And believe you me, the music they play, people think it's really, really simple. It may sound simple, but to recreate it is very, very difficult.
Well, that's a whole
great players.
That massive sound they produce is
great
unreal.
Players and really, really good writers. So they were like Thin Lizzy, they were hand in hand or whatever. So they were acceptable. And a lot of the prog rock music went out of the door. It was like punk didn't like prog rock. A lot of it went out the door and was considered bad and unfashionable. Yes, Jethro Tull,
Rainbow.
Rainbow weren't prog rock. I mean, actually Deep Purple were like Black Sabbath, where they were forerunners of that this genre. They were, and I think looking back on it now, to this day and age, Deep Purple are overlooked. their song "Strange Kind of Woman" and "Highway Star" and those those kind of things that they did.
Yeah.
Are often now overlooked.
Yeah.
Rainbow was the guitar players band. It was a different thing. But they had hits during the new wave of British heavy metal era. They managed to have really commercial hits, "Since You've Been Gone," "All Night Long," all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, what was it like? Well, it was regular gigging.
Yeah.
And as we mentioned in another episode, where we're talking about fictitious bands, there's a band called Bad News. And that was filmed during that era. It was made during that era, or towards the tail end of it. And I would say that Bad News were definitely new wave of British heavy metal, although a fictitious band.
Yeah.
So there was Iron Maiden, were probably the first band that made it out of that.
Yeah, well,
era.
I think the Maiden thing's interesting, isn't it? Because they, for a long time, didn't get signed. I think they formed in 75. And they weren't signed until like turn of the 80s because they were continuously told that you should be a punk band, and they were very much against that.
Well, I have a story about that. I remember sitting in my dad's car. It was a van. My dad had a van, sitting in his van. And in Stratford, there's a place called Maryland Point. And you go down Leytonstone High Road, and you go around a bend, and there used to be a pub called the Coach and Horses, and it would have been around about that era. There was always a sign up that they were playing.
Yeah.
This was before punk.
Yeah.
So they were there.
Kicking about. Well, they've been going for a long time. I know their first album, Iron Maiden, their song Phantom of the Opera is heralded as one of the classics of the new wave of British heavy metal. It wasn't until they got Bruce Dickinson on board with his more operatic style was when they really kind of hit the mainstream and kind of began breaking out and becoming a bigger sort of beast within themselves.
Well, Bruce Dickinson, lovely bloke as he is, interviewed him once or twice. I have really nice guy, nice guy, whatever. He was in a band called Samson.
Samson, another massive band from that sort of era.
Yeah, they weren't that well. They didn't really crack it, but the idea was that they were there and they'd been remembered.
Yeah,
but they changed singer. It's a little bit like when a football team are doing really well and suddenly the manager goes.
Yeah,
it's like, well, why did they do that?
Yeah,
whatever. It turned out that it worked out. If I'm not going to get involved with it's correct decision or incorrect decision. I mean, it's a little bit, I suppose, a little bit like AC/DC. Was Bon Scott better than Brian Johnson, or Brian Johnson better than Bon Scott?
Can of worms.
It's a debate basically, and we're not going to go there on that. So this whole scene that was appearing, there was a magazine that appeared called Kerrang.
Kerrang developed, didn't it, from Sounds? It was first put out in Sounds magazine, wasn't it? Which
it did.
Because it was clocking on to the excitement that was going on with metal and the new wave of British heavy metal.
And the brand still exists to this day.
Yeah.
Channel 4 own it.
Do they?
Yeah, Channel 4 own it. They bought it off of VMAP, which was the magazine publisher.
Yeah.
And there's the channel, the Kerrang channel.
Well, I grew up on Kerrang on Kerrang TV. For me,
that's it.
That's how I discovered all of my music predominantly come from Kerrang. If it wasn't Kerrang, it was Scuzz, and if it wasn't Scuzz, MTV2 was occasionally more rocky, but Kerrang and Scuzz, particularly Kerrang, were the big ones. I'd have it on all the time.
I was involved with this most fantastic documentary with Kerrang when they were at EMAP, which was the 20 greatest rock deaths.
Yeah.
You can't get it now because of the clearances on it.
Yeah.
I was involved with the archive, all the footage and stuff. We got Alice Cooper
really
to
cool.
present it, and it was a bit of a homecoming for me.
Yeah.
Sort of going back.
Absolutely. I bet.
So going back to the British heavy metal, it probably lasted about 3 years, 2 or 3 years.
First wave.
Yeah, like every subculture does. Yep. And there was, I could reel off loads of bands, like off the top of my head. Angel Witch was one that I remember that was gigging when we were gigging. They were always around. Maiden had already made it. Def Leppard got a huge write-up in Sounds and got snapped up by Phonogram, which is now Universal straight away.
Interesting point. A lot of people cite Def Leppard getting signed to a major as kind of being the death of the new wave of British metal kind of era. They said they kind of transcended the sort of genre and it got too big with that album. Was it Pyromania, I think it's called? That
was the second album.
Yeah, people cite that as kind of being the death.
Well, they got signed on a big record deal, basically. Yep. It was a huge deal, and the record company got a producer in, which was Mutt Lange, and they wanted to make they were asked to make an album that was a rock version of Thriller Michael Jackson, which is Pyromania.
Yeah.
That was the whole idea of it.
Yeah.
And they went to America, and it's history now what they did.
Yeah.
But
Well, sorry, just to interject as well. Their kind of interest in breaking America, I think, turned a lot of fans against them in the UK. I think there was an infamous Reading set, maybe in 1980, where the crowd were just hostile towards them because they were kind of rejecting the British side of new wave British heavy metal, and they were trying to break into America, obviously for what the financial reasons for all of it. And for the fans weren't. I didn't think the fans respected that, because I think, like you mentioned, with the punk influence, the new wave of British heavy metal was very much like DIY and from the ground up, and they were almost becoming something bigger. And I don't think that was well received.
You didn't have to be a great player. It was like punk.
Yeah.
You didn't have to be a great player. That was the issue. You know, that was very prominent.
Yeah.
I mean, we played with so many bands. I mean, we were pretty good, I thought. You know, but with a lot of the bands, it didn't matter, and it didn't, and it still doesn't to this day. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But the actual era was really odd because it took a couple of years before there were any sort of there was any commercial success. I'd say that Iron Maiden were probably the first, but a lot of the older acts had updated themselves. So you had people like Judas Priest, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But there's people like David Coverdale, who'd been in Deep Purple, replaced the original, not the original singer, but the great singer Ian Gillan. No disrespect to David Coverdale. And Whitesnake jumped on that as well.
Yeah.
And that's when Rainbow, you mentioned before, and that sort of came along with that. But really, it wasn't like, it was a little bit like how the new wave thing was. You know, there was some very unusual sort of new wave or punk bands. The all girl band, the Slits. You know, some people listen to them and say they were absolutely terrible. Those girls couldn't play or anything. They're fantastic. There was a magic. You know, it was a chemistry or whatever.
Yeah.
But a lot of people on the punk thing jumped on the bandwagon as well. And again, it was very much like punk about what you had to wear. I remember there was bullet belts. These metal stud things. I would never wear anything like
that.
Very,
very Priest-esque again. You know, they're cited as being the guys who really pushed that. You know, Rob Halford was. You know, it's interesting. You know, as the guy who came out in recent years as a gay, he cited a lot of his influences from that culture, which is kind of almost the kind of foundations of metal clothing now, so the leather and the studs, isn't it? And
that's true.
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting the world he took that from, kind of S&M sort of stuff, to making it the sort of uniform of metal.
And you look at things like early Slayer and Metallica. Definitely influenced by it.
Well, we'll get on to that in a little. That's a whole other, you know, sort of how important the new wave of British heavy metal was. I think you made some really interesting points as well there. Appearing, you know, from being involved in that scene, you know, must have been a great time. You know, gigging regularly. You know, the explosion, and particularly the kind of DIY underground ethic of the early stages of new wave of British heavy metal. Being involved in that from the middle must have been, you know, it must have felt pretty, I don't know, maybe if in the time you realised how special a time it was, but now looking back on it.
Well, it was quite interesting because there was I remember there was another subculture coming up at the time, and that was the second visiting of mod.
Okay.
So it was bands like the Purple Hearts, you know, people like that. And then Two Tone happened. You know, the Scar, you know, the Jerry Dammers Specials era. That was all around exactly the same time. I remember gigging, going up and down the country, and Ghost Town, where the Riots were on. And I was a child practically, sitting in a van, you know, driving around or whatever. That was like number one single, but I related to it. It was another subculture, and of course there was other things going on. So New Romantics was happening at that time as well. It was very, very diverse, and the reason being for it was A, you could make your own fashion. B, you could make your own music. C, you could go and belong to something without really, you know, busting money or anything like that. 4, you belong to something. Without being pigeonholed or being, which unfortunately is not there now. As I say, we'll revisit subcultures in the future another time. But the new wave of British heavy metal thing was, you know, I look back on it now, although I was involved with it and playing with it, my influences and stuff was, you know, I mean, I like Bowie and the way Bowie dressed and sort of stuff like that, so I didn't wear any. Remember, I had a black leather jacket. but I had pink hair.
Yep. Nice.
26-inch waist, and we'll put some pictures up for you, by the way.
Yeah.
I was quite proud of. So I was a little bit, in a way, look, and the band that I got together, which we'll do in the second part of this,
Yeah.
and I'll get one of the old members in who's still playing to this day, who absolutely fabulous guitar player, and a very good friend, and very funny. We'll bring him in.
Yeah.
I used to get stopped and searched by the police all the time, because I looked different.
Yeah.
You know, the old, what we used to call the meat van used to drive past.
Yeah.
Stop, get out, search me, you know.
Yeah.
My father always said, don't argue with them,
Yeah.
you know, whatever. And that's changed now, and something we'll visit and talk about on the, you know, on other subcultures or whatever. It was very easy to do.
Yeah.
And it was very easy to be part of something.
Yeah.
And in that era, it was quite fantastic to be involved with any of those things. So not only was I involved with that, but I did actually visit. There was 2 clubs as a 16-year-old or whatever it was. It was La Beetroot and it was the Blitz, which we knew because I had pink hair.
Yeah.
I remember I used to go down the King's Road.
Yeah.
I had a Saturday job. We used to go down the King's Road. Didn't go to school or whatever it was. You go down King's Road and buy this thing called Crazy Colour.
Yeah.
And I dyed my hair pink.
Yeah.
Or, you know, it would last for about a week or whatever. You just put it on your hair and wash
Yeah.
it in. Or it was blue,
Yeah.
which has been really popular in a couple of years.
Yeah.
I see students and people walk around with that colour
Yeah.
hair, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
I did all of that.
It's really interesting how the sort of hair thing as well, because believe it or not, I once, many a moon ago, used to don a Mohican, and I also dyed it pink, because I fancied myself as a bit of a punk who always did his homework on time. We went off on this music tour with school, and my friend said, oh, let's put pink in your hair, and I was like, you know, yeah, of course. And it kind of stuck, and did it look good? I don't know, but I used to love it. And I used to like identify with the sensibilities of punk, but I was always very respectful and always, you know, I never like spoke out and stuff. But it's interesting how kind of hair and what you do with it is also kind of a big part of subgenres, you know, like from you doing it pink, back in the scene. So kind of it's still coming through now, and the whole kind of blue hair becoming really popular again, and greens, and how hair is almost like wearing a patch badge. Like you used to wear badges back in the day.
That's right. Of course. It was black. You reminded me. Fans used to have like a black leather motorbike jacket with a denim jacket with the sleeves cut off
Yep.
over the top of it.
Yep.
And all the patches, you
Yeah.
know, all the patches, badges,
Yep.
the belt,
Yep.
you know, it was either like a kind of metal kind of belt with like metal strips on it, or they were said before bullet belts.
Yeah.
Martins, Dr. Martins normally, or industrial, sort of the old industrial hobnail boots.
Yep.
A ripped pair of old jeans, not ripped for fashion.
Yeah.
It's just they were ripped.
Yeah.
Normally patches on those sometimes as well,
Yeah.
and generally long hair.
Yeah.
Was the big thing.
Long hair was a real call to arms, particularly for metal, isn't it? It's a
And headbanging.
headbanging comes with that, you know, and knew we had headbanging with long hair. I feel like I would have been shunned from the scene, even though I'm a keen, you know, I love the genre.
But
I wouldn't have fit the bill.
But you've also reminded me on that as well, because the headbanging thing, the media, the press in this country used headbanging, which had been going on for years before new wave of British heavy metal. I think used to call it idiot dancing.
Yeah.
At gigs.
Yeah.
With the headbanging thing, they used it like punks
Pogoing.
wore safety pins,
Oh yeah.
or dustbin bags, which was actually made up by the press.
Yeah.
When it started to get commercialised, the same thing with that as well.
Yeah.
It was exactly the same.
Yeah. I think they jump onto anything, don't they? They can latch onto. It's a shame. I think an interesting development that did again come from the new wave of British heavy metal, the air guitar. There was a few like hard rock discos cropping up in like North London, and this is where air guitaring is kind of is said to have been derived from. Is taking the DIY work ethic to a new level of, well, I can't play guitar. I'm
Well,
going to
they
guitar.
have competitions now.
Yeah.
Well, they have done for years, and that's a really good, interesting point. And we'd like to know as well what you would think online. Would Guitar Hero, the computer game, ever have happened if metal would never have happened?
Well, I know what my answer is. I'd love to hear from you guys. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think, you know, hearing about your input there is really insightful, because yeah, this is like reading a book, because you're on the ground. I think for context, so this is the new wave of British heavy metal. the new wave suggests there was obviously a form or something, which would obviously in this case be heavy metal. For context, just so we can give a bit of context as to how, the new wave came about and what come after the new wave of British heavy metal. So, as we know, metal music is widely regarded as stemming from the Midlands in England in the 70s, with Black Sabbath being considered, the fathers of heavy metal. With our first album, Black
Judas
Sabbath.
Priest from the Midlands as well, yeah.
Well, literally, so I think the term heavy metal was coined after the Black Sabbath debut album. It was released February 13th, 1970. The first track, there's a thunderstorm, and then that low kind of growling guitar. And it was unlike anything that had been heard at the time. That sort of level of, that level of doom almost, which is over in America. You was end of the 60s, the flower power, the hippies. It was all, sunshines and rainbows. In England, we had recession, we had lower unemployment levels. It wasn't a good time, really.
Like now.
Exactly. Well, I have a side note. Me and my friends have been discussing there should be a thriving punk scene right now. Everything going on in England, there should be a thriving underground punk scene, but that's a whole other thing. But we'll come back to that. But I think, so at the time, there was social deprivation, there was poverty, and there was unemployment, really high unemployment rates. The guys in the Midlands are working in steelworks and factories, partly where the term comes from, heavy metal. So when Black Sabbath released that, it was coined as heavy metal, and there was a few bands, around similar area that were doing that. Cause we had Sabbath, there was kind of Deep Purple amongst it all. Led Zeppelin were floating around. It wasn't quite heavy metal, it wasn't quite rock, it was kind of in the middle. That kind of laid the foundations of what metal was, and it was always kind of rejected as well by the press and media. It wasn't really seen as a good thing compared to punk, which was kind of heralded by the press. And punk kind of almost killed off metal, which is when the new wave of British heavy metal came about as a reaction, and punk was like an injection of steroids into metal. It kind of revived the genre because it came back as the new wave, which you were a part of. So in terms of time frames, it was quite a short span, wasn't it? The new wave, like you said, it's the new wave.
Yeah, it was. It didn't last a long time, but what it created and the offshoots which came from that to this day now is extraordinary.
Yeah.
You have so many different forms of metal now.
Well, black
metal, death metal, rap metal. It goes on and on and on.
Exactly. I think that's a really great point. Cause I think because there were so many different kind of genres or influences on metal playing within the new wave. Before that, it was coined as hard rock or heavy metal. But as we know, there's many stems from that. And I think the new wave of British heavy metal with its various influences was crucial to then categorising future metals as to it's not just heavy metal anymore. Are you thrash metal, are you speed metal, are you power metal, are you doom, are you black metal? There's so many different genres which it spawned. It was like planting a tree,
yeah,
and then watching all the arms grow out of this tree. And I think that's why it's so seminal to the genre, because it did give way to thrash, which of course gave us almost the biggest metal band of all time, considerably Metallica, and what that's done for the genre. So really, I think, although it's not often talked about, the new wave of British heavy metal is really crucial to the metal genre and music in general, and keeping the genre alive. And like we mentioned, metal was kind of on the ropes for a little bit, then when punk come along, and then as they took kind of punk's sentiments and made infused that into a bit more metal. Bands like Motorhead were kind of accepted by the punks, because generally punks and metalheads were kind of at war with each other. They didn't like each other. But then bands like Motorhead, for their intensity and the speed, were kind of embraced. Lemmy's kind of was fit into them circles. Was it the UK 82 scene come from punk as well, which is we had a strand of that kind of getting into the new wave of metal with certain bands playing the D beats, and then the other side of it which kind of spanned off into glam metal. I think it was really crucial, and like you said, without new wave of British heavy metal, would Guitar Hero and other sort of culture around that have been what it is today?
I think that's pretty much what I would think and say as well. It really, but then it was a sort of underground thing as well, because you got the creation of Metallica and bands like Slayer from that. But really, what basically happened was, out of America, you started getting what I call poodle rock.
Poodle rock. Please clarify poodle rock.
Bon Jovi. No disrespect to them, but
soft rock.
It's not even soft rock, but it was just
style over substance.
It was extremely commercial.
Yeah,
it wasn't underground at all. and it overtook everything for a few years. And then I remember about 87 or 88, I heard Napalm Death.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
Right, okay, here we go.
Yeah.
And from that, there was all sorts of stuff. But the one thing that I think after New Wave of British heavy metal, the one thing that did kill it off a bit with the American invasion of the Poodle Rock thing was no stadium British metal bands anymore after that.
Well,
it just went.
Like you mentioned with the toilet.
The Americans picked up on how to play it.
Well, the toilet circuit, obviously, where a lot of these bands cut their teeth and built this sort of subgenre.
You couldn't do that now.
It's very underground. Whereas the reason it stayed that way, it kind of worked in its favour and against it. A lot of A&R reps were just too slow on pickup, so they weren't willing to book these bands in big arenas. So you play big like local venues, but no one really, like the major labels weren't overly interested to begin with. So you never saw like Venom stayed very much underground. I don't know if Venom would ever have signed with a major, but a lot of these sort of bands never got the chance to play. Then Maiden kind of broke out. Def Leppard went the American route. But I think because of A&R, because of the labels, maybe like lack of speed on this, because it was quite a short space of time anyway for this subculture. By the time they clocked on, really, they weren't willing to book these bands to play bigger venues because they didn't really understand it, and it was kind of rubbished in the media quite a lot as well.
Well, they also got caught out on the punk
Punk
and new wave thing, where they spent lots of money signing acts and jumping on the bandwagon. It happened in 2010 with grime. Same thing happened. They just didn't get it. They didn't get it, and I think if you compare those two subcultures, not for what they produced, and grime is miles away from metal.
Or punk.
Or is it? Whatever. New wave of British heavy metal. But the major record companies, I don't think people that worked there really understood how both of them worked.
Well, and sometimes for better or for worse, because punk in its sensibilities, it wouldn't have made sense to be signed to major labels because that's just not very punk, is it? And grime, it operates on the underground, that keeps it credible. That kind of makes it relatable for the people that are involved.
Yeah, absolutely. But they did try to jump on it, with grime. But we'll talk about that. In a different episode. But you are right. The comparability is there. For the two of them. But it didn't last, it didn't last a long time. But then really when you look at all sorts of subcultures, they don't last a long time.
You know what? And I think there's always the risk of, if a subculture goes on for too long, it almost in a way starts to parody itself and become uncool. Like, you see it all the time. Like, if something goes on, you kind of get the first wave of people who think this is really cool, and then it kind of gets a little bit more commercial. People kind of get involved. With that, they bring their own ideas, and it kind of gets further away from what it originally was meant to be. And then maybe some of the original people get turned off from it, or they go and form their own sort of subculture. And it's interesting how the life of subcultures develop and how they die. I don't know. I mean, like I said, metal still carries on in various forms to this day, and it's still massive. The fans are extreme. Probably the most loyal fan base, aren't they, in any sort of genre of music, potentially?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I definitely agree with that.
You've got Maiden.
Long term.
Well, Maiden, although they've released like hundreds of albums, maybe not as commercially viable, but they're massive fan base, though. Still, whatever they put out, they buy, and they go and support them. They go and watch them play headline arena shows around the world still. And they, realistically, I like Maiden. I'm not a massive fan. I like what they do, and they keep putting out albums out, but they keep selling out arenas. They obviously got their fan base, and any sort of metal band
all over the world.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's part of the appeal. I think loyalty is quite key to metal, and I imagine as part of your in terms of subgenres not lasting very long, metal just seems to be long living.
I think that when EMI signed them, they were very quick off the mark. And got them out there very, very quickly. As you were saying before, the major record companies were looking at all these bands or whatever, and not willing to take a chance. It was a very brave bet. That they did. And got them where they were. And where they are now. Quite fantastic, really. But going back to the Poodle thing, talking about the Poodle thing, the other interesting thing was I mentioned the whole Napalm Death thing, but the thing after that was Nirvana.
And grunge.
Nirvana, if you listen to Nirvana, to my ears, it's Black Sabbath, but it's also classic new wave like Echo and the Bunnymen.
And like shoegaze.
It's like the two put together. they were really lucky to get a break or whatever, and that got rid of a lot of the kind of mullet haircut rock music, American music that was going on. There was a lot of European bands as well.
Yeah,
man, that became unfashionable overnight.
Well, again, another subculture, grunge, is predominantly kind of based in Seattle. Very DIY ethic again. Bands playing small venues. Even when Nirvana in '94, when they released the Nevermind album, the first few months they were still playing small local venues, and then it exploded and they started.
They
playing
weren't here.
arenas.
They were huge here.
Yeah, I mean they were really big, but even so, like, it was still small venues, and they went into like a tour, went to Japan and stuff, and played massive arenas.
Yeah.
Which, again, grunge in Japan is a very interesting sort of thing to look at. But that's a whole other thing, because the sort of Japanese characteristics, behaviours, and sociological approaches to things compared to grunge are like chalk and cheese.
Nirvana we will look upon, but all I'll say about Nirvana is it's really, really interesting, because everyone sort of thinks about Nirvana were the first band out of all of that, and then people talk about Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, that kind of thing. But an album that I was involved with, which was before all of that, was a band called Mother Love Bone. And Mother Love Bone, half the singer died, but he was very like kind of Bowie influenced. Mm-hmm. But the band became Soundgarden and Mudhoney.
Yeah, nice.
The two of them. That's another time, but it still does come into that, because I would be very surprised if any of the musicians in any of those music would never have listened to any new wave of British heavy metal. I'd be very surprised.
Well, yeah, I think I'd be surprised as well. Interestingly, Dave Grohl always references his love of the Beatles and the melody they brought, and then he goes into grunge. The new wave of British heavy metal influence, I guess, the thrash movement like we mentioned before. Slight segue. You mentioned Mudhoney. Did you know that? So when Nirvana got rid of one of their previous drummers, they spoke to Dave Grohl about joining the band. He was initially unsure because he was in Scream at the time, and he was kind of unsure about leaving his band behind, moving again. So when he phoned him back and said, actually, I'd like to do it because his band are in decline, they said, oh, we've already signed someone else, and they signed. Well, they'd taken in the drummer from Mudhoney. So very temporarily, the drummer of Mudhoney was the drummer of Nirvana. But then Chris, the bass player, and Kurt felt bad for almost breaking up one of their favourite bands. So they let him go back, and they didn't take him, and they took Dave Grohl. But slight segue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they would have, they would have known about that, about new wave of British heavy metal, that was that had happened years previous to that.
Yeah.
And really with that particular era, it was very different to what it is now, and any kind of new music that anybody wants to promote now, the roots were very, very different. There were 3 major music papers.
Yeah. The
national press hadn't really taken too much notice of anything apart from punk. They didn't have like Guardian Online now has a whole music section. Then would they have had that? No. Would the Daily Mirror have had a section on? No, they wouldn't have done. Well, so it was really the 3 newspapers and gigging and getting a following.
Yeah, it felt. I was doing some research. It felt quite fake because I was looking at the new wave of British heavy metal, and there was like a Guardian article on like 10 most important songs of of the new wave. And I thought it feels quite weird reading a Guardian article about when it was always rejected at the time, and it feels very middle class and very anti new wave of British heavy metal to have them.
But the thing that made it, the real thing that made it was, we're talking about big bands here, and the bands that went on to make it. But the philosophy that they took, well, philosophy is the wrong word, but the ingenuity that they took from punk, and this is why the word, I think, new wave should really be considered. This was, if you couldn't get a record deal, you could press up your own record and get it distributed.
Yeah.
No different to now when you are, students and people want to put, or even older people want to put their tracks on TuneCore and do it themselves. The only thing was that you had to carry a lot of heavy boxes around to get them distributed, and you had to promote it or whatever.
Yeah.
But you could do it yourself, and that was the whole ideological
approach,
ideology of punk. And new wave as well. If you couldn't get a deal, you could just press up your own stuff and go and get it distributed, and that happened in dance music.
Yeah.
Years later, like house music, acid house, and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah.
It happened, and that's how it happened.
Well, that's part of the magic, isn't it? It was the whole kind of press it yourself, and then there would be certain like you mentioned, North London. There were certain like hard rock discos they called them, where people played the big kind of new wave songs of the time, but also they played demos from the bands as well. And it's how Iron Maiden kind of got a bit of a break, because all word of mouth, people would be trading cassettes as well, people making fanzines, that sort of way of, people making magazines about their favourite bands, and it was all kind of, that sort of word of mouth approach was really genuine, and I think that's why a lot of people felt quite protective of it. It was rubbished in the mainstream press by a lot of people were criticised for not being very good musicians, because compared to the original sort of metal, or maybe in prog, which were like, they were virtuosos in prog, in new wave, because it was a punk influence, you didn't really need to be a great instrumentalist.
Oh, if you got your demo in the top 10 in sounds,
yeah,
they had a top 10 demo chart.
Yeah.
If you had your demo in there, a journalist would come to see you live, and you got your demo in there. Wow.
Yeah.
That was it. And the whole idea was I did it. Pressed up, 7-inch single, pressed up X amount of copies.
Yeah.
Got a distributor, or whatever.
Yeah.
That's how it worked.
Yeah.
Some of those singles are really valuable now.
I bet there's some gems in there.
Really valuable. Yeah. Not that they were, a lot of them weren't particularly good. It doesn't matter.
No, but that's part of the magic, isn't it? Like, I think you see some of the early, like, Venom stuff, and it was like they really focused. Some bands really focused on the sort of doom elements of metal, but ignored the production. Whereas then, as you're going to get towards the end of maybe the new wave, there was more of a focus on production and making like cassettes and records that people could actually listen to. And was, the production was better, should we say? Yeah,
for the first time, it was like the punk thing. You could sell your records at gigs.
Yeah.
Which people have to do now.
Yeah.
To sell merchandise and stuff in order to make money.
Well, if anything, there's been more of a push.
Or to pay for the petrol to get there and get home.
To get around. I think people are going back almost to the independent sort of way of making music now, because they've seen the history of major labels like mistreating their artists and not giving people opportunities. I think now it's almost more of an aspiration to be in control of your own music and be independent. We're using the internet, for example, and other means to get yourself out there. Whereas at one point, getting signed was obviously the be-all and end-all. Even back then, I think getting signed was obviously seen as sometimes holy grail in the end, because it meant money, it meant a career potentially.
Well, they used to say it was something like 50,000 acts chasing one major record deal at a time in the UK.
Yeah.
In the UK. Yeah. I don't know if the numbers are as great as that, but they certainly are. But looking on a major record company's side, it costs a lot of money to launch an act.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what genre of music they are. A metal act in particular is expensive.
Yeah.
You've got to put them out on tour.
Yeah.
You have to put them out on tour.
Yeah, there's all sorts comes with it, isn't there? And
although things like branding and sponsorship for metal bands now is a lot, a lot of brands and sponsors, because as you said before, the fans will stay with them forever.
Yeah.
They're not. It's not a fad.
Yeah, no, they are. The fans a lot. I think a lot of lifers, which is great, because you don't see a lot of that anymore. In general, it's nice to kind of like have that loyalty, almost, and kind of, because as I said, it is a sense of belonging. I've been involved in subcultures, as have you. It's a sense of belonging, even sometimes more than the music. It's just that sense of belonging and identity.
That's right.
Which I think sticks with you for a long time.
So the new wave of British heavy metal, very different to metal that we were talking about, was, so some of the established acts sort of jumped in on it. They could release albums.
Yep.
But really, new wave of British heavy metal bands that couldn't get deals or big deals, a lot of the time it was just the one-off singles.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think maybe the genre was so short-lived.
I even think Def Leppard originally released their first single, pressed it up themselves.
Yep.
Their label was called Bludgeon Refoda, I think.
Nice.
It was, and it was nothing like the way they ended up sounding.
Yeah, I bet. Well, you just mentioned some other labels which were key to the new wave. So again, very kind of like.
Let's see if I remember.
Yeah, a lot of bands are making them themselves, but the big ones. I mean, you've got to stress the importance here of the Midlands and the north of the country, which seems to be really honing this. So there's from Newcastle, you had Neat Records.
Neat Records, I remember really well.
Yeah, Neat Records from Newcastle.
Whitley Bay.
Whitley Bay, nice. Yeah, again, pioneers. In Durham, you had Guardian Records. Again, that part up in that neck of the woods. In Hull, was Ebony Records.
Yeah.
And in Wolverhampton, there was the originally named Heavy Metal Records.
Yeah.
And again, I think these ones, they were obviously independent labels, but they were the ones that are pushing the new wave of British heavy metal. They saw it, and it was, again, you wouldn't be pressing nowhere near as many as the majors, but they had the local community which were involved in subculture, and they were just feeding that fan base, and they were being really loyal, and it was kind of like a mutual relationship. We're going to support you and you support us. It's kind of, you're part of us, we're with you, and it was almost tribal in a way. there's a real sense of like belonging. Okay, you might not have got like hundreds of thousands of people listening like you do with the majors, but then the people that do listen to you are way more engaged with your band and like, eat, sleep, and breathe your music.
Well, people that start independent record companies,
Yeah.
and or production companies, many independent record companies are the life and breath of the global music industry.
Yep.
It takes about 28% of the global music industry, but the interesting thing is, those labels you mentioned, if you look at new wave labels, Stiff Records,
Yeah.
just instantly comes to my mind. 90s Creation Records.
Yeah, Alan McGee.
On another podcast in this series, I mentioned Domino Records.
Yeah.
We will do a podcast about independent record companies.
Yeah.
They are the life and breath of the music industry because they are creative, and the people that are behind them believe in the acts that they sign, and for the love of music as well.
It's definitely more of a lifestyle choice than a job. They fully invest into that. They've created their own label.
The making millions thing, that's later on and all that kind of stuff. But it's basically that they are involved with signing music that they actually like. Neat Records, I remember really, really well, and they had a band called the Tigers of Pantang, and they had a singer.
Pantang. Yeah.
They had a singer called Jess Cox.
Yeah.
And he left, and they got somebody else in. They got picked up by a major, and I think when Jess Cox was the vocalist, they were really new wave of British heavy metal.
Yeah.
I think MCA signed them. I could be wrong, but I think MCA signed them.
Okay.
But they, they originally, I don't know what happened to him as far as what happened in the band. The old bands have their grievances and arguments or whatever. And again, there's another podcast, I reckon, where I could tell a million things about that.
There's so many, isn't there?
But as a subculture, if you look at every subculture, there was the independent record company, even before when you could do it yourself.
Yeah.
So if you look at the whole mod thing just very quickly, which we're going to touch on, there was things like Atlantic Records, which was an American independent. There was Island Records that were released in ska and then reggae, who were an independent or whatever, because Chris Blackwell, and then there was Motown in America.
Yeah.
It existed even then.
In stacks as well.
Exactly. South of the States. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing with Stax was it was again we'll visit this at another time. Black and white musicians together.
Yeah.
Playing.
Yeah.
But it can't exist without the independent record companies and subcultures. I don't think can.
Absolutely.
An independent. I mean, I never really liked Spandau Ballet. New Romantics. Not my cup of tea or whatever. But they signed to Chrysalis, who were an independent. If you look at around that same era as new wave of British heavy metal, electronic music was coming up.
Yep.
Gary Newman signed to Beggars Banquet.
Yep.
Another, still going to this day.
Yep.
Another independent.
Yep.
Great. Probably with Island Records, the greatest independent record company. Probably the reason being for all of that is because the people at the company care about
they
music.
care about what they're doing. They're invested in it and they believe in it.
Correct.
Yeah.
So with the new wave of British heavy metal, what we're going to do is we're going to do a second part.
Yep.
George is going to love it because I'm going to bring in one of my very good friends who was in a band with me in the new wave of British heavy metal. We're going to talk about that.
Yep.
He's got some great stories like I have, and it's going to be real fun.
Authentic stories from the scene. I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be awesome. What I'll do is I'll put that bit. I'm going to edit that bit so kind of at the end because that's a nice way to end.
Yeah.
We've got a few more bits we should touch on, like what comes next from the new wave in terms of thrash, just Metallica and stuff. And we'll mention briefly lyrical content, I suppose. So just to quickly add, lyrical content-wise of British new wave of heavy metal was quite, I guess, they would cover a wide range of fantasy, kind of horror influenced, sci-fi influenced films. Escapism was a big part of the lyrics, wasn't it? You see it a lot in Iron Maiden with their mascot Eddie. Obviously, there was quite a wide spectrum, but it's all kind of fantastical sort of escapist lyrics, potentially.
Oh, I've got my two fingers up here, not the proverbial two fingers.
Yeah.
The devil.
Devil horns.
Angel Witch.
Yeah. Well, again, a lot of that comes from Sabbath, doesn't it? And like they're dabbling it into the occult, and everything to come from that, and then a sort of darker shade sort of.
They signed to EMI.
Yep.
But I don't think that it was a minor hit. They had a track called Angel Witch as well.
Yep.
It was a hit. It was a minor hit. I think it was like a top 30, top 40, somewhere around there. Record company, I would imagine the record company just couldn't get it.
Probably didn't get it. Yeah, exactly. Even though it was massive, and it was taking off, they wanted some of it. They probably didn't know how to manage that properly and how to,
But some had great names. There was another band I remember gigging at the time, Praying Mantis.
Praying Mantis.
What a great name!
But
it was with an A.
Oh, nice.
As in praying.
Yeah, Praying Mantis.
Praying Mantis. Yeah.
Dumpy's Rusty Nuts was another new wave British heavy metal band.
Yeah.
Bashful Ali.
Yeah.
Obviously Tigers of Pantang, which you mentioned, and Def Leppard. Also, you've not mentioned yet, in a very, very male-dominated genre, the Girl School, one of the very, very few all-female new wave of British heavy metal bands kicking about. Girl School.
Now I'll come on to Girl School last of all, but there was another band who I thought was better than them, which is a new wave of British heavy metal. They were really good, Girl School. They even did a great single with Motorhead.
Well, and they headlined Reading Festival in '81.
They did a great single with Motorhead. It was an old Johnny Kidd and the Pirates song. It was a huge hit. It was great. Baby, Please Don't Touch. I think it was something like that. It was great. They were really good, Girl School, but there was a band that came along after them. I reissued their first album, Rock Goddess.
Again,
they were just great. I saw them live as well. They were just great.
And you've got to say they're very forward thinking. They're in a very male dominated genre, and so they weren't afraid to muck in, and they really left their mark. I think they're often kind of unsung heroes almost of musical development.
They signed to a big indie label, A&M, and it was when Universal Polygram bought A&M. Universal A&M. I remember going through Universal's archive and looking at some of the stuff they hadn't reissued. This was just downloading had started. So it's about 2004, 2005. And I sort of going through, thinking through acts, and I thought, Rock Goddess, they made a lot. They did a few albums, but their debut album was critically acclaimed. Had never been reissued. Let's get it out. Whatever.
Absolutely.
And even when you hear it now, it's one of the few albums from that era that it stands. Some of it stands the test of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
The guitar player, she was really good. They reformed a few years later, and they were still good. I think they got back together. I think they called it A Day now or whatever. But they were real. I think it was two sisters and a friend in the band initially. And I think the dad managed them or someone managed them or whatever. But they were really good.
No, again, they're great. Again, very much almost pioneers of kind of women in metal as well at the time. Would we have had, like potentially bands like Evanescence kicking about, female fronted, Nightwish as well, another one. But again, massive inspiration of the time and kind of breaking down boundaries and barriers and kicking down doors, which is very inspiring. The last band, which will lead us on to a nice segue to talk about what happened after the new wave and how important it was. This band, Lars Ulrich of Metallica, cited as being one of his biggest inspirations, along with the other ones we mentioned, was Diamond Head.
So I remember them. They were around about the same time as well. They were originally signed to Neat, I think. I think they were with Neat. I could be completely wrong, but they were the kind of band that, with the three major publications I was talking about, Sounds, mainly Sounds, but NME and Melody Maker, these three press papers that came out, and in the fanzines as well. Whenever best newcomer act or whatever, they were always in the 10 for a couple of years. And they looked like they were going to. I liked probably not about Def Leppard, but they would be able to cross over. And it would be global or whatever. But they never did. I don't know the reason why, and it's something that I've never thought about, look back on, but I will do. But I actually remember them gigging as well, and they were selling out pretty big venues. At the time. And they were, I think musically, they were already crossing over as well. If I remember rightly, they were pretty good players as well.
I think they were sharp. And they're obviously cited by Lars amongst many other acts for inspiring them, which takes us nicely to, I guess, the final point is the impact, just how important the new wave was, because of it. Then, like we said before that point, metal didn't really have subgenres. Bands that weren't metal being labelled as heavy metal. If they were hard rock, they'd been bunged into heavy metal. If they were more glam, it was all kind of getting coined under the same term. So this gave, I think, what come from this and the subgenres was really important for music, because from this particularly came thrash, because like we said, Metallica are massively influenced by the bands you've listed,
Yeah.
and arguably without the new wave, there'd be the big four, so to speak, wouldn't exist. The big four of thrash being Metallica, Anthrax, Megadeth, and Slayer.
Yep.
And then from that, the sort of stems that labelling spread as well. Metallica, although they're called the most corporate band ever, they're also arguably the biggest metal band of all time, because they just continue to chug along, and their records are absolutely insane. I think like their first album, I think must have sold 120 million compared to Black Sabbath, which sold like 15 million albums in general in the first sort of few years. I think for what they've done is absolutely insane. So without new wave of British heavy metal, who knows, like how things could be looking now for rock and metal and the various other subgenres.
Well, I would, if I was in a metal band now, and release everything digitally, I would still press up 500 7-inch singles.
Yeah.
I would and get someone like Rough Trade.
Yeah.
And some of the metal stores are still still around.
Yeah.
I would look upon it, and do that.
Yeah.
Just to get the ball rolling. I think that they could still possibly work.
Yeah.
As well as doing it all digitally or whatever. But coming back to that final question. It is interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned, by the way, just as a side view there, you mentioned Anthrax.
Yeah.
I remember Anthrax had a rap, did a whole
They got
rap thing.
rappy. There was a whole thing, wasn't it? I mean, you had bands coming through, like Run DMC were collaborating. Anthrax collaborated with someone.
And from that, you had things like Rage Against the Machine.
Well,
fantastic.
Well, Aerosmith dabbled into it when they were in decline. They did the Run DMC track, which is arguably, even though it's not their sound they got big for, that was arguably one of the biggest, most popular tracks now. He'd Run DMC, Rage Against the Machine. And from that stemmed, again, people are gonna have opinions. From potentially came new metal bands like Limp Bizkit, Papa Roach.
But interestingly, on a final note, going back to labels.
Yeah.
Would the Dutch label Roadrunner
have
taken off if it wouldn't have been for new wave of British heavy metal?
Well, Roadrunner, became massive, didn't they?
Well, they are now.
Well, they still are. Yeah.
I know Warner's own a percentage of them, but the question is, they came out at the end of that.
Yeah.
They mid 80s, 84, 85, I think it was.
Yeah.
They came out at the end of that.
Yeah.
And they were doing some really interesting things. They didn't go down that poodle rock avenue.
They stayed authentic, I think, which is why they've done so well, isn't it? They're one of the most respected metal labels because of the people they sign. Like you said, they ignore a lot of the sort of.
Well, they had this great rap band in the 90s. I really loved them, called Dog Eat Dog, and they were a rap metal band, but they're a sax player.
Yeah.
A sax player
in a rap metal band. Yeah.
But because Roadrunner was still an independent at that point, a lot of the acts they would sign would never become like a huge stage. And then 10 years later, Roadrunner had Nickelback and all that kind of stuff.
I was going to say, if anything, maybe some of the bands never truly breaking through might have helped, in a weird way, might have helped Roadrunner stay credible, because they were kind of servicing
They still are.
Yeah. I mean, but in terms before the Nickelback stuff, when they were kind of their sort of subgenre almost, when they were signing bands who were getting notoriety within the scene, but they weren't breaking through, that might have made them seem more credible and more integral to the genre. And then obviously what come after was the Nickelbacks and the more polished sort of stuff, which might have undid some of their sort of legacy in some people's eyes.
Well, it's true. And the other thing is what the majors are terrible at doing is, I wouldn't say they're terrible at doing it, but if they get something from a subculture in the past, so you'll look at Nirvana, Ron Geffen, who by that time were with Polygram, which is now Universal. Sony got Pearl Jam.
Yeah.
They're always in competition with each other,
Yeah.
And that goes back time immemorial, to people like, Paul Simon in the 70s and 80s, the folk singer or whatever. He's with Warner's, and then Columbia, which became Sony, would have an opposing artist. It was that kind of, and in a way, it takes away that whole indie kind of thing that's there. But there's always going to be people that are going to want to start their own label.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what format they use, and if there's a subculture knocking about or there's a subculture involved, they are going to want to be part of it, or they've seen something, or they're involved with something.
Yeah.
That wants to do that.
Yeah.
And we'll visit independent record companies, definitely.
Yeah.
We talk for days
Well, we
about
were
that.
thinking
yeah.
that we could talk on this subject for days and days. So we're probably best now wrapping it up.
I think so.
Part 1 and
with part 2. Hopefully, folks, you're going to laugh.
I'm looking forward to it.
You'll laugh your head off when we get my mate, and we're not going to say who it is at the moment. We're going to get him in. Love your feedback, especially those of you that used to go to gigs during that era would be great.
Or are you like me and have you discovered the genre
Yeah,
after it existed?
absolutely right.
I love metal, I love rock, I love all that sort of stuff. We'd love to know your opinion. About everything we've discussed. You can hit us up on our website, realityjukebox.com, or on social medias at Reality Jukebox.
And even, what was your favourite subculture?
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, exactly.
See you next time.
Have a good one, folks.
Thanks
you.
for listening.
Bye.